Those of you who have seen my film Ponds and Footpaths will be familiar with the principle that our public footpaths have evolved from pathways used for centuries to get to water, work or worship. In the Ponds and Footpaths film, I concentrated on two paths that were used to access water. In this film, I look at a different network of local paths that were used to get to worship. I call these paths to salvation. In days gone by, footpaths were not used for leisure, but were the shortest way to get from A to B. Most people travelled everywhere on foot, and local roads were impassable for pedestrians for at least half the year. Cutting across fields was the quickest way to get anywhere. We start our walk outside the former primitive Methodist chapel that's now called Chapel House. The field opposite is called Chapel Green. It is difficult to imagine the importance of the primitive Methodist chapel to this village for the century of its life from 1839 to the 1940s. The Prims, as they were known, were essentially working class labourers who did not identify with the Anglican Church and the somewhat middle class Wesleyan Methodist Church. If the Anglican Church was Marks and Spencer's, the Wesleyans were Waitrose and the Prims Lidl. No frills, no ceremony, they were evangelical and more than a touch puritanical. The man most associated with the primitive chapel in North Marston was Mark Price. He was a lay preacher, superintendent and chapel keeper. He was also an agricultural labourer. He was so intrinsically linked to the primitive Methodist chapel that to many people it was simply known as Mark's Chapel. The large congregation at the primitive Methodist chapel comprised mainly of servants and manual labourers. Attendance at the chapel far exceeded that at the Wesleyan Church and at St Mary's. Most of the congregation travelled here on foot, sometimes several miles across the fields. The fact there is a divergence of 3 footpaths at this point is no surprise. Over the years, these paths would have brought hundreds of people to worship here. By any consideration, these are worship paths. And so our walk begins by following one of these worship paths as it heads southeast across the fields. path we are taking meets with a work path. This map shows our route drawn in red. The junction of the paths is in this large field called the hill field. Being a well-grazed pasture, the actual line of the footpaths is not visible at this time of year, so the transition could be anywhere. This is the walk as mapped onto a satellite picture. In the 1800s, people in rural communities commonly walked many miles to their place of work. A walk of 4 or 5 miles would have been nothing unusual, and the shortest route would have been chosen, a path cutting across the fields. To landowners and farmers who depended on manual labour being able to get to their place of work, this was perfectly acceptable. With no public transport and the roads little more than quagmires for much of the year, routes across the fields were used by everyone. The path we're now joining from our right is a pilgrim path that emerges over this footbridge. It carried pilgrims from Quainton Church to North Marston, mainly during the spring to autumn period when pilgrimages were most popular. Pilgrims visiting North Marston made a huge contribution to the economy and viability of the village. The pilgrimages to John Shorne's shrine and Holy Well became the third most popular in the country. The income to the church rose from the equivalent in today's money of £500 per year to well over £2 million. The pilgrims on their journey to North Marston visited neighbouring churches on the way. We know this by the scratched marks they left in those churches. From there they would have taken the most direct route possible, and their paths are captured in the network of footpaths we can see today. We can see pilgrim paths crossing our parish boundary from every point of the compass. This path heads to the unseen horizon. There will have been wayside crosses close to the side of the path to guide pilgrims across this unfamiliar territory. But when the church comes into view, why didn't the pilgrims take a more direct route? The land they were crossing was an open field, worked in furlongs by local villagers. It would have been nearly impossible and very disrespectful to cross the ridge and furrow workings, so the pilgrims would have followed the headlands or balks that separated the furlongs. As soon as they could, they would reorientate to their objective. This is where the modern footpath ends as it joins Portway. For the pilgrims, the route from here went directly to the church, as shown by this map. Of course, there was no road here then, and the Quainton pilgrims' journey to the Holy Well was little more than 100 yards further on. There they would have been joined by fellow pilgrims who had travelled the last leg of their journey from the churches at Oving, Whitchurch, Granborough and Hodgston. In this film, we have followed a worship path created by the primitive Methodists in the 1800s and another created by the Roman Catholic pilgrims 500 years earlier. In both cases, these would have been seen as the path to salvation.